We launched the World Energy Outlook yesterday in Brussels, but the official launch happened already last week in London, and probably a lot of you have already seen a lot of the news spreading around, mostly focusing on the resurgence of US oil in the States. However, for those of you who haven't seen the Outlook, 1/3 of this book is devoted solely to energy efficiency. So after the first press wave that was focusing on this news, we are seeing more and more energy efficiency messages being picked up by the press. I would like to start saying something about this book. It was led by our office, done in very close cooperation with the Energy Efficiency Unit and with Yamina in particular. Most of you have read the draft report, and we really want to thank a lot of you for the comments we received, because we believe they were really instrumental to make the work more robust. First of all, I would like to really thank Niels, because the comments from eceee were extremely helpful, and I have to thank the Commission for the very extensive exchanges we had even at the very last moment. Okay, having said all this, I am sorry for those of you that were yesterday at the launch as well, because there are some things that I will have to repeat. The first being that when setting the contest, I have been doing this Outlook for some years now, and sometimes we tend to repeat always the same things, so it gets a bit boring. But this year we were quite surprised ourselves to see messages that were so profound and pointing to really a changing in what we call the foundations of the energy system. The first one, we have to say, refers to the more conventional oil and gas production stories, and mostly looking at two countries, at Iraq and the US, where we have seen incredible growth in Iraq of oil production, and where we expect a lot of new oil in the future to come from. We are expecting 45% of the incremental new oil coming to the markets in the next 25 years to come from this country alone, and I let yourself judge the uncertainty that may be related to this very finding. And the other one relates to the US, where we have been looking for many years at downward trends in conventional oil production, but for the past 3-4 years, due to unconventional oil, we have seen an increasing, surprisingly increasingly, US oil production that is changing the balance in the international oil scene. The second point that is quite important is that following the Fukushima accident, some countries have started rethinking nuclear and output nuclear in their energy mix. This is having consequences that are a bit more profound than we had expected only last year. It is having also some consequences in terms of course, risks and the cost of new nuclear installation, putting an additional uncertainty of how quickly new nuclear will come online. And the big question is, if not nuclear, what else? Is it going to be fossil fuels, or is it going to be renewables? And finally, something that is not really taking as much limelight as it should, only over the past year, there was introduction of legislation in energy efficiency in all major consuming countries. We are not saying that it was possibly the best energy efficiency legislation ever and it was comprehensive, but at least that there is an increasing attention focused in most energy consuming countries in this. First of all, at the EU level, but we shouldn't forget in the US the fuel economy standards, looking at transport very in depth. We shouldn't forget Japan, that has just released this year the new strategy which points to a net reduction in electricity consumption of 10%, and of course China with the energy intensity target, but with very aggressive policy on the industrial sector, really touching upon the very structure of the Chinese economy. Again, something that has not been picked necessarily by newspapers, but on average, if you look from 1st of January to now, the oil prices, average oil prices that we have seen in 2012 are the highest ever in real terms. This, of course, is putting an additional brake and an additional stake to our economic growth globally. Always looking at prices, something that we were not used to see and we have been seeing over the past year or so is that gas prices are diverging. So we are seeing extremely low gas prices in the US, as low as $2 per MBTU. Prices that are 5 times as high in Europe and an incredible 8 times higher in Japan. So a very, very big divergence in gas prices that has implications for electricity prices as well, and therefore the competitiveness, the relative competitiveness of those regions. The bad news is that we are still seeing symptoms of what we call symptoms of an unsustainable energy system that are still there, and even worsening in some cases compared to what we were seeing only last year. Fossil fuel subsidies were up 1/3 compared to the year 2010, that they are reaching 520 billion. We are talking about $500 billion wasted subsidizing fossil fuel consumption, which is an incredible amount of money. We have seen last year the highest energy-related CO2 emissions ever, and at the same time seeing the renewable energy industry facing some difficulties because of budgetary problems within countries that are subsidizing it, and because it's still an industry that is at its infancy and competition is very high, and some question marks about its future growth. Another point that we have been always underlying for the past many, many years is that despite many international efforts, including the one by the United Nations and its Secretary General himself, in dedicating a special year on sustainable energy for all, the year 2012, we're still seeing 1.3 billion people without electricity. And we always underline this as morally unacceptable, and we continue to do so in this outlook. And I've closed the presentation.
Oh.
No, the final point, this year we have looked for the first time at water, and in particular water needs in the energy sector. I will not go into any detail, but just want to give you a couple of information with regards to that. Water is becoming increasingly a problem for the energy sector. In particular, I would like to mention 2 things. First of all, new coal construction in China and India, and especially power generation, coal-fired power generation in those 2 countries. Its economics are being increasingly determined by the availability of water. And this is becoming more and more challenging, putting some pressure to new coal-fired power plants. The bad news in this sense is that some of the most efficient coal-fired power plants require more water. So sometimes this is creating an absurd, rather an undesired effect to go to subcritical because it requires less water. The other pressure that we're seeing with regards to water is unconventional gas and oil, and in particular the 2 key countries that I mentioned earlier on, Iraq and US, will need incredible huge amount of water in the future to mobilize all these oil and gas resources that I mentioned before, putting a challenge on the infrastructure that needs to be built. So this is the context, and I will go now very quickly. You know that we developed one scenario that we call the new policy scenario, and it's our base case. It includes all the current policies and the ones that are not introduced yet, but they are under consideration. Under this scenario, global energy demand is expected to increase 1/3 from now to 2035. A couple of key messages here. First of all, the share of what we call OECD countries is going to go down dramatically. In fact, the energy demand in those countries is not going to grow very much, only 4% from now to 2035, so it's almost stable. And one of the key reasons behind that is the energy efficiency policies that those countries are actually implementing. The other reason is that those economies are maturing, and therefore they need less energy. The other key point is that China is going to increase even more its weight in terms of new additional energy demand. Second will come India, and immediately after Middle East. So you will have a shift not only from OECD to non-OECD countries, but more importantly, a shift towards Asia of the new oil, gas, and coal trade. More and more, they will be focused in the in the Pacific basin, and less in the Atlantic one. Which fuel will satisfy this incremental demand? 50% of this we expect to be gas and renewables. I will immediately go to the implications of this in terms of energy security. All major economies today, meaning the one that contribute the most to growth, to our GDP, have a relatively high import dependence in terms of oil and gas today. So China, India, European Union, and Japan have are all dependent on external imports for their demand for oil and gas. And the situation is going to worsen dramatically in all countries. Of course, in the EU, but China is going to be in a very similar situation. Fatih yesterday was saying Japan cannot go worse than that, so it's stuck out there, right? So, but you see the very incredible thing, and if you plot last year's results, they were completely different. The United States is going the opposite direction. And the reason why the United States is going the opposite direction, meaning that mostly it's going to need very little imports of oil within the next 25 years, is for two reasons. The one I mentioned before, that it's increasing its unconventional oil production. The second, very important, and they weigh 50-50. So 50% is increasing unconventional gas. The other 50% is the fact that they have introduced new fuel economy standards for cars, and it will save a lot of oil compared to what we were expecting just a few years ago. So their import needs are going from 10 billion barrels per day to just 6. So it's really shrinking very, very dramatically. Are we happy with this new policy scenario? Meaning, what kind of messages are we giving to policymakers? Are we doing a good job to put the energy system in a good direction? Well, from the energy security point of view, we would rather say no, but we can do something, and energy efficiency helps us to do something. In terms of long-term temperature increase, CO2 emissions, we are doing rather bad. This points to an increase in long-term temperature of around 3.6 to 4 degrees, which means that the likelihood of following such trajectories to a 2 degrees is less than 6%. So is like saying, if you continue like that, forget about a 2-degree target. And finally, does the new policies would give access to the 1.3 billion mentioned at the beginning? Well, the answer is rather not. They will become richer, so by the end of the projections period, instead of 1.3 billion, we'll still have 1 billion without access, but it's still unacceptable. One number only that I would like to add as a corollary to this sentence about energy access. When you look at the additions in terms of new capacity that is needed globally, India and China are the ones that are overwhelmingly larger than the others. But if you look at the electricity consumption per capita in 2035 of an Indian, you will see that it's equal to the average US electricity consumption of 100 years ago. And this is rather shocking. So even the country that is growing the most and in a very quick way will still have a very, very large gap compared to the developed world. The other point before going to the efficient world scenario, it's on renewables. I want to highlight one fact about renewables that is also a big question mark about whether the projections will materialize. To meet the 2020 targets, that is not only the one of the European Union, but there are several 2020 targets globally for renewables, we have globally committed already over $2 trillion. So to meet the 50% increase that I was mentioning earlier, globally, renewables, we will need the support of 3.6 trillion. What we have done up to today has already committed taxpayers and consumers to pay 1 trillion. To meet the 2020 target, you need an additional 1.6 trillion. For biofuels, you will need 1.2 trillion. Now, the reason why I put these slides, for all renewables altogether, we are talking about roughly 5 trillion type of support that will be required to push them and to make them either competitive or at a level that can enter into the market. It's a big question mark whether this money is well spent, and redesigning subsidies that are cost effective to consumers is a very big highlight that we're trying, a big message that we're trying to pass through. And we sometimes even encourage countries to see whether if you spend these times in, for example, energy efficiency, what would be the net result. So really try to understand, to have a very coherent energy policy where your $1 spent, especially if it's come from government, where the debt is important, where you better put your $1 or €1 bet. Now, we go to the big theme of this year, which is energy efficiency. The first analysis that we did was to try to understand, if we continue with those policies that we have on the plate today, are we doing a good job in exploiting energy efficiency potential? So we defined certain efficiency measures, and we decided which were viable or not viable, deciding that only measures that had a payback period within a certain threshold would be taken into account. We are not being particularly aggressive. One could think even having longer payback periods. And second point that is very important, we did not consider behavioral changes except ones that are price-induced. And we all know in these rooms especially that behavioral change could have a magnifying effect and raise even additional savings. And what we see is that with current policies, we only tap 1/3 of the economically viable potential. Where we are doing a particularly bad job is buildings, and the reason is very easy, is because it's a very difficult sector, and Yamina can talk later about that. I think it took a long time to understand what policies in the building sector could work. We now know it. It's about spreading them faster, not only to OECD countries. Some of them are started doing a good job. I think we need to mention the UK Green Deal in this respect. But we need to make aware other countries in the developing world that there are ways to deal with new buildings and more difficulty with existing buildings. So what can we do? Can we do something differently? Of course we can. First of all, we wanted to understand what can we change in the global energy system if we were able to tap all these economically viable potential. Well, the first thing is that global energy demand would be cut by half. Just to make you understand, because sometimes this doesn't really resonate, what does it mean? If you look at the 2-degree trajectories that some of you may, of course, have been come across recently, well, we are talking about this kind of global energy demand growth. It's just the mix would not be the same, but already with efficiency, we are going to the level of energy demand that would be the good one to meet the 2-degree target. What do? We save all fossil fuels. We save coal, significant amount. We save gas. We save oil. And we have a bit of impact on other fuels as well, but it's rather not very significant. I will just describe what happens in oil markets, but the story is very similar in the others, so that you would understand what kind of transformation we are talking here. In the new policy scenario, you have oil demand increasing steadily, and you have oil prices increasing steadily because oil demand is putting an upward pressure on supply. In this case, you would face yourself with a completely different world where you have a peak demand. So we have been hearing about this for a long time, but actually if you implement quickly efficiency measures in cars and trucks, you can achieve that. Before 2020, which means that you would have a peak oil demand and a peak oil price, then declining oil prices. Of course, there would be some rebound effect here that policymakers should be taking into account and think about pricing policies to take that into account. But we are talking about a completely different energy market, which is not a supply-driven market, but a demand-driven one. You're talking a completely different market in terms of energy security. Now, this is another rather incredible benefit or co-benefit that all importing countries would enjoy, is that you see your GDP grow. Now, in this period, talking about having a measure that is not directed to increasing growth, but has as a side effect increasing growth, is like funding a golden egg. And why does it happen? It happens because you shift some of the investment from the supply side to the demand side. You need to incentivize those investment, of course. You have to spend 12 trillion more in energy efficiency over the period, but you save, in terms of energy expenditure, much more than that. It means that households and industry would have more money in their pocket that they will invest in something else. But you are in a world where you make energy efficiency the norm, so you are adding value and growth at a much smaller energy intensity. If you look at Europe only, you are talking about increasing 1.1 percentage point of GDP by 2035. Globally, just to give you again a sense of these numbers, because sometimes they're just enormous, you add over time 18 trillion, and 18 trillion is the economy today of US, Canada, Chile, and Mexico. So over the time, you would be adding another North America, globally. It's an enormous amount of money. Of course, it's a big transformational chain where some of the money that you would direct in the supply side would go into demand energy efficiency measures. So the question is, how do you do that? Before going into the CO2 emissions part, I would like to mention two other co-benefits that are not really taking much of the limelight, but they are equally important, especially for some countries. Since you delay the need of building new infrastructure, especially in developing countries, especially in China and India, where your first fuel of choice is coal, so you shift the construction of new coal-fired power plants, it means that your situation in local pollution in countries and in cities like Beijing, New Delhi, etc., would be much improved. It means that in terms of health, and therefore there is a secondary benefit that we are not taking into account here in our GDP, you have less health cost. Therefore, your GDP would even have another impact that we are not considering at all here. And second, for those countries where energy access is a problem, 1 unit of electricity that is not consumed, that is wasted, but is made available in the grid, it's just like adding new capacity. You have all heard what happened in India this summer, a tremendous blackout. Well, if India would go the efficient world scenario way, which for the very case of India has really very low payback periods, where you would make available the amount of electricity that you would need to give the population that is currently deprived, 600 million people, at least with the very basic energy needs. So it's a rather very important message for those countries that buying into energy efficiency has an enormous amount of co-benefits that are good for the society at large. If we look at CO2 emissions in particular, here we look at a very specific angle. We're looking at what we call carbon lock-in. So this is the trajectory that ideally you would have in a 2-degree world. We haven't plotted here the new policy scenario, but you would have it increasing steadily. So the current energy infrastructure, without adding anything, no power plants, cars, industry, nothing, will continue to run anyway because of its economics. So some of them will be retired, and we take that into account because either are not economic or arriving at their end of their economic lifetime. But will already eat up what we have today, 80% of the permissible emissions to 2035 under a 2-degree trajectory. If we continue with the policies that we have currently in place, every year we add new infrastructure, so every year we eat a bit of these permissible emissions. The infrastructure we will have in place in 2017 will eat up all the 2-degree trajectory, which means that after that you only build zero carbon. it means that every new car that goes on the street is an electric vehicle, and that the new power plant that you put to make the fuel available for that car is either renewables or nuclear or fossil fuel with CCS. Likelihood of doing that, 0. If we go the efficient world scenario way, so if we implement quickly the economically viable efficiency measures, again for the same reason I was explaining before, you delay the need of building new infrastructure, you buy time. You buy 5 years, you have not solved the problem, because the efficient world scenario does not go to a 2 degrees trajectory, it goes to a 3 degrees trajectory. But at least, if we convince the negotiators, at least you want to do one thing in the next 5 years, do energy efficiency, and then sit very clearly on the table and put together a climate strategy with a carbon price. You have five more years to get an agreement, which is a very much wanted good news nowadays, where we are not hearing much of a very good news, as climate change has completely disappeared from all the talks. I was very amazed to read that it was the first time in 25 years that in the US elections, none of the 2 presidential candidates mentioned the word climate change in the 3 debates. The first time in 25 years. It's an incredible news. If we focus just 1 second on Europe, but I will not say much because there are people that can talk about Europe much more knowledgeable than me. Those are the results that we have for Europe. Here I'm plotting total primary energy demand that includes non-energy use. So if you're comparing with the Commission numbers, you will see a difference. But we are meeting in 2020 the 20% reduction target and continuing. So this is what you would see over there. I think the only key message that I want to give here is that most of the saving would come from gas, which has a very interesting negotiating positions in terms of imports from a number of neighboring countries. So some key messages here. It's the following. Only taking into account the economically viable efficiency measures, as I said before, in this room, there may be people that may well think that we were conservative on the payback, so we could push even further, but that would cut 15% compared to today's 2010 demand, which means you are in a declining trend for energy demand, and you continue to do so, improving very much your situation in terms of future import needs. Key sector that you need to look at, it's buildings. It accounts for half of the savings. And of course, in Europe, we are mostly talking about existing buildings. The additional investment you need, most of them are for buildings, but is equally important transport and industry, 2.2 trillion over the period, but over the same time period, consumers would save 5 trillion. I want to say something. This kind of underestimate the savings because we are cutting in 2035, but a lot of the expensive investment you make at the end continue to save money afterwards. So it's a dodgy way to show the results. You actually get more than that. The other key message on imports is that they would still grow compared to today. We are already paying something like 400 billion. We paid 400 billion in 2010. We paid even more in 2011, around $500 billion. But by 2035, in this scenario, they would be 170 billion less than if we go the normal way. And finally, another very good news is that CO2 emissions, you would get a lot of cuts from sectors mostly other than the ETS one, but also in the ETS, also because electricity demand is reduced, that they would come in a very, very nice way. We have set some principles that we think are key to put forward to make this happening. We know that the recipe is very much country specific, so we are not going to go into very much of a detail because each country has to integrate energy efficiency in energy policy their own way because everyone has different priorities and different specificities. But the first thing that we are saying very clearly is first, measures your untapped potential. We are saying to governments, measure your untapped potential in energy efficiency and put that in your energy strategy exactly as you do for coal, gas, oil, and renewables. This is the first step we are telling them. Second, look very carefully at governance. You can make governments better. You need to put energy efficiency as a government priority, because only at that level you see all the co-benefits. You measure the impact on growth, on environment, on health that we mentioned earlier. So only at government level you have to put it a priority, and then have a right governance that goes to the insulation, but starts understanding that the benefits are very wide. Make it visible to consumer. Make it affordable. Think about smart financing instrument to make the additional cost at the beginning affordable. Start talking to financial institutions to find good ways to mobilize this money and to shift them, because we are really talking about a shift from one side to another one. It's not new money, it's money that you are shifting. Make it the norm. We are basically saying, check out the bad stuff, just say it's banned, and put in place whatever fits better your own country. Shall it be a standard, or may it be incentives according to your own liking, but push through the most efficient options. I would conclude here, and very happy to take your questions if there are. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive and interesting presentation. I think we can take one or two on questions for just to clarify, but for discussions we will not take questions now. That will come back to that afterwards. Randall?
Thank you very much.
You need to have a microphone.
Not without the microphone. Thank you very much, Laura, for a very clear and straightforward presentation, even more credible than Fatih's. A quick question, and it is clarification. If I understand you correctly, when you did the co-benefits, the societal co-benefits, you didn't make an attempt to quantify, like, health effects?
No, we just stopped and understanding what the impact on local pollution would be.
But
we know that would have implications for health, but we couldn't do that.
But I mean, just off the top of your head, if you were to try to quantify health, employment, budget, foreign balance effects, who would benefit most? Would it be India, China, or would it be the developed countries? Do you have any feel for that?
I think that India, China would stand to benefit a lot.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, because already in terms of the GDP, they are the one that benefit the most, and they are the one that very clearly have a very strong benefit in terms of reduced air pollution, the largest.
Okay. And then the second question, buildings are half or a very large share of the potential.
In Europe, yeah.
Yes. If you were to you use simple payback periods, which is a pretty rough instrument.
Yeah.
If you were to use something approaching life cycle cost analysis, have you any feel for how much that would shift your potential?
I think rather dramatically. It's rather dramatically, yeah.
Okay, I think we will notify that the point of multiplying benefits and other benefits will be one of the points we will come back to on our discussions after all the presentations. I think we could continue for that now for a long time, and that's not the case we should go for. I think the idea was next.
Thank you for your presentation. One of the bases is your assumption on potential. And it was not really clear for me which is the time horizon. So could you come back to the slide on potential and to explain what type of potential is it? Is it from 2010 to 2035?
It's a cumulative.
Is it a total potential? So could you just elaborate more on that figure, because it's not clear enough for me.
What we have done here, this is, if you want the cumulative savings that you have from 2011 to 2035, given certain assumptions on payback, and they simply measure the savings that you get against a baseline in the new policy scenario. So if you include the policy currents plus sum, or if you tap it all. So this is the ratio of the savings over the 25 years.
Well, thank you, Laura. One of excellent presentation, and thanks for the energy outlook. I think it's always a very important point in the year when you publish it. My question is, it's very interesting that you raise the issue of water scarcity. Did you link the shale gas production to water demand? That could be a sort of a restriction to this technology?
Up to a point. We could do it only up to a point because it's very site-specific. And it would require a granularity of data that for the time being we don't have. So we did take into account if you want additional cost to produce the shale gas that would put a cap, but we didn't look at every single site in the US to say whether that specific site will have or will not have water. We have, there is another point that it's important to raise. We have looked earlier in the year the potential of shale gas in a different publication which we called Golden Rules for a Golden Age of Gas. And there we were really pushing unconventional gas, and the results were rather different from what we publish here, so you could even go more bullish. And the assumption we were making there is if you comply with the set of strict environmental regulation, then you can really tap a lot of the resources, and this is how much you can get. When we went into the normal outlook, we revised all those into a much more moderate, a conservative assumption. So it's in a way included. It's not as bullish as it could be if you look at the resource base.
Thank you very much.